Did you know Shiloh, the first permanent dwelling of God in Canaan, has a well-documented history of worship, from its rise to its fall? The Bible traces Shiloh's significance as an early religious center, long before Jerusalem took its place. According to Joshua chapter 18, verses 1-3, the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Shiloh during Joshua's time, around 1400 BC in the biblical timeline. The text reads, "The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The country was brought under their control, but there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not yet received their inheritance. So Joshua spoke to the Israelites." For centuries, Shiloh stood as a vital center for worship, which came to a tragic end when the ark was captured by the Philistines in what the Bible describes as one of Israel's most humiliating defeats. The account in 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 10-11, paints a grim picture. The Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The Ark of God was captured, and Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. This devastating loss marked the end of Shiloh's role as Israel's spiritual hub. Even though the Ark was recovered 7 months later, it was never returned to Shiloh. Instead, it was taken to Kiriath Jearim, where it remained for decades before finally reaching Jerusalem during King David's reign. By considering the biblical timeline alone, the Book of Samuel indicates that Shiloh was founded around 1400 BC and destroyed around 1100 BC, a couple decades before Saul's reign, after nearly 3 centuries as a prominent religious center. Modern chronologies, though, present a significantly different timeline.
While the scholarly consensus suggests that Shiloh's city worship altar was established around 1600 BC based on radiocarbon dating and pottery analysis, it is generally interpreted that Joshua's conquest, which marked Shiloh's founding, occurred much later, around 1200 BC. Excavations further indicate that Shiloh's destruction took place during the Late Bronze Age, with many scholars dating this event closer to the end of this era, around 1150 BC. This poses a significant challenge. If Israelite worship began only around 1200 BC, Shiloh would have already been a well-established religious center by the time Joshua arrived. It weakens the traditional view of Joshua's conquest as pioneering a new religious center, instead suggesting that the ark's placement at Shiloh may have been a substitution of existing Canaanite worship practices rather than the creation of a new altar. Besides, an 1150 BC destruction date leaves an extremely short window for the extensive events described in the Book of Judges. This period, which the Bible depicts as unfolding over multiple generations of social upheaval, tribal conflicts, and religious disobedience, becomes challenging to reconcile with the proposed archaeological timeline, which compresses these extensive events into a mere half-century, no longer than the span of a single lifetime. To resolve this tension, some archaeologists have suggested pushing Shiloh's destruction closer to 1050 BC. This date better aligns with the biblical narrative, but the fix may be worse than the flaw. It effectively extends the Late Bronze Age into a period typically considered part of the Iron Age. This adjustment is extremely problematic. The archaeological evidence from Shiloh, particularly the absence of Iron Age pottery and typical settlement patterns of that period, suggests the site was destroyed at the Late Bronze Age, not well into the Iron Age. Extending the Late Bronze Age into the Iron Age is seen by some scholars as an attempt to force the evidence to match the biblical timeline rather than allowing the archaeological data to speak for itself. This unresolved dating debate has led some scholars to suggest that the biblical narratives, including the accounts of Shiloh's destruction, are best understood as mythologized history. In this view, the biblical text preserves real historical memories, but these memories may have been reshaped or compressed to emphasize theological themes rather than provide precise historical details.
However, what if the timeline itself is the real issue? Could adjusting the dates of key archaeological reference points provide a more coherent framework for understanding these events? By aligning the unearthed fallen walls of Jericho and the emergence of Shiloh's altar during the Middle Bronze Age, which are both currently dated to the 1600 BC to the biblical timeline of 1400 BC, a different historical narrative emerges. The objective is to utilize documented archaeological evidence as key reference points for anchoring them inside the biblical timeline, positioning the well-attested Bronze Age events in alignment with the biblical timeline, rather than forcing the biblical narrative to conform to a predetermined chronological framework. First, aligning the dates of Jericho's destruction and Shiloh's emergence as a cultic center from the 1600s BC to 1400 BC brings these events in line with well-established biblical timelines. Second, since a central focus of this study is the reinterpretation of the Habiru revolt described in the Amarna letters as the Hebrew revolt under Saul, this approach necessitates adjusting the timeline of Akhenaten's predecessors to coincide with Shiloh's destruction. While traditionally dated to the early 1300s BC, this revised chronology places the period of Akhenaten's predecessors closer to 1100 BC. This realignment brings the biblical timeline into closer harmony with the Book of Samuel, correlating its passages with attested events and figures found in the Amarna letters. This chronological adjustment, which shifts the archaeological timeline forward by 200 to 300 years to align with the biblical timeline, effectively preserves the necessary time frame for the intricate cycles of conquest, decline, and renewal depicted in the Book of Judges. This revised framework ensures ample time for the unfolding of these complex events before the establishment of Saul's monarchy. By integrating these archaeological milestones with biblical traditions, this perspective aims to reconstruct a more coherent and historically grounded understanding of the complex period surrounding Shiloh's rise and fall. But could the shift of these milestones from 1600 and 1300 BC in modern chronologies to 1400 and 1100 BC be too significant to overlook?
One might wonder, wouldn't radiocarbon dating reveal any major mistakes in archaeological timelines, especially errors of hundreds of years? The simplest answer is, it does. The Iron Age 2B period, roughly from 900 to 700 BC, presents a unique challenge for precise dating. This period coincides with the initial phase of what's known as the Hallstatt Plateau, a phase where atmospheric radiocarbon levels barely changed. Because radiocarbon dating relies on these fluctuations for accuracy, the plateau makes it hard to pinpoint exact dates, often resulting in date ranges that can stretch across multiple decades or even centuries. Adding to the problem, this period suffers from gaps in archaeological records and poor preservation of continuous organic materials like wood, the key to creating reliable tree ring records that help calibrate radiocarbon dates. This cycle of uncertainty raises important questions about the true nature of the plateau, whether it represents a natural phenomenon or an artificially constructed anomaly designed to uphold a flawed chronological framework. Such a framework appears to extend the Iron Age 2B period by 200 years and exaggerate the early Iron Age timeline by as much as 300 years altogether, ultimately causing events predating 900 BC to seem significantly earlier than their actual occurrence.
To resolve some of these dating challenges, alternative theories have emerged. For instance, the Egyptologist David Rohl proposed reinterpreting Pharaoh Shoshenq III's campaign, traditionally linked to the Egyptian campaign of 928 BCE, as instead aligning with the reign of Jeroboam II around 760 BCE. This would compress centuries of history in an attempt to account for known gaps in the archaeological record in the early Bronze Age. In short, while radiocarbon dating is a powerful tool, periods like the Iron Age 2B reveal its limitations. After all, it may not be mere coincidence that the period presenting the greatest challenges in both archaeological findings and dendrochronological sequences aligns precisely with the emergence of a radiocarbon anomaly. By stepping away from modern assumptions, which frequently impose rigid, conventional timelines, and embracing the Bible's timeline, we find striking archaeological evidence and a refined radiocarbon calibration curve. The settlement and destruction pattern at Shiloh, along with the corrected Hallstatt Plateau, stands as a compelling testament to the accuracy of the Bible.